Human rights are good, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Who could argue with that? Well, me. I could argue with it. Despite being enshrined in the way we think and talk about ethics and politics, human rights stand on very shaky philosophical ground. And the funny thing about human rights is that both sides of the political aisle would object to eliminating them from the way we talk about politics. Your red blooded conservative American would object because opposing the founding fathers is a cardinal sin. Also, many conservative talking points revolve around the right to liberty, freedom of speech, right to bear arms. You get it. But liberals fare no better. To a liberal, pretty much everything is a human right. Money, college educations, not guns, but health care, especially abortions, and I'm probably missing a bunch. The problem with these views on rights is that they get us nowhere. Take a common issue of disagreement abortion. Both sides will cite human rights in defending their position. The pro life camp will say that an abortion denies the baby's right to life, whereas the pro choice camp will say the real right being denied is that of the woman's bodily autonomy. And the argument would probably degenerate into yelling and ad hominem from there. The problem is that neither side has any way to argue that one right is more important than another. So let's get to the idea of human rights, where they came from, and why they're no good. First, let's establish a quick definition of what I mean by human rights. A human right, sometimes called a natural right, is the idea that by nature of being a human, one should expect certain treatment by others and by governments. I don't like to use the word I'm defining in a definition, but to put it simply, and I think everyone will get it, human rights are rights that we have because we're human, or we have inherently as humans. They're granted to us by no other virtue than the fact that we exist. It's important to understand that the idea of human rights did not always exist. For instance, the classical Greek language has no word for the concept. The closest we get is the idea of rights given by law. For instance, someone has a right to a piece of property because he paid for it. I've seen some argue that the Stoics have an equivalent in their idea of natural law, but this looks very different than the way we understand natural rights today. Natural rights really begin to take form in the Enlightenment with thinkers such as John Locke. In his second treatise on government, Locke formulates what soon became the rights that made it into the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and property. The founders changed property to pursuit of happiness, and we're not going to get into why. Here's the quote from Locke. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will consult it, that being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So here, the law of nature is brought to understanding through reason, and that's important. It's not primarily understood by studying religious texts or other metaphysical considerations. And what does reason teach? That people should not harm each other's life, liberty, or possessions. But how does Locke get to this point? He looks at creatures in nature and how they operate, or more accurately, how men outside the rule of government exist. Here's another quote from Locke. A state, also of equality, wherein the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and use the same faculties, should also be equal. Locke, as well as the founding fathers, were Enlightenment thinkers. This is important to understand as we try to parse the reasoning for their choices. One of the main, perhaps the main objective of the Enlightenment was to found philosophical principles on reason, logic, and empiricism. This was in contrast to past thinkers who primarily cited Aristotle or the Bible as the foundation for their philosophies. So Locke and the founding fathers were doing something sort of new. They wanted to create a foundation for political and ethical imperatives without metaphysics. and natural rights is what they came up with. Wait a minute, I can hear you saying. Have you read the Declaration of Independence? How can you say they're trying to remove God from the equation? Well, let's read it now. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Created equal? Endowed by their Creator? I can see people are going to argue with me. It sounds very metaphysical, but it's really not. Hear me out. First of all, while the intellectual world was busy secularizing things in the Enlightenment, your average folks were pretty religious. So it makes sense to dress up whatever you're doing in religious verbiage. And I'm not denying that John Locke or the Founding Fathers were Christian, though I do have my doubts about some of their claims. I'm simply saying that the Enlightenment project was in full force here. We should really be looking for its influence in these texts. The problem is that when the Founding Fathers say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were endowed by our Creator, they forgot to consult someone very important. Somehow, in the business of revolting from the British, they forgot to ask God what he thought about these rights. The fact of the matter is, you will not find the idea of human rights in that form anywhere in the Bible. It just doesn't exist. Now, people have extrapolated them from other things, and I think that the concepts that human rights are trying to espouse are true and helpful, but the idea of looking at them in terms of rights is not. Remember when I said that the ancient Greeks didn't even have a word for natural rights? Well, the New Testament of the Bible is written in Greek. And worse yet, the Old Testament, which as the name implies is even older than the New Testament, is much farther chronologically from when people were thinking in terms of rights. And I think that when we look at the foundations of these sorts of rights, we'll understand that they don't really make a whole lot of sense. You see, for a right to exist, it needs two elements. First, it has to be given by someone with authority. Then, it must contain a mechanism to enforce that right. Without both of these, we have something less than a right. I like to use the example of a parking space. Say you are a higher up in a company, and the company gives you a special parking space very close to the building. It has your name on it, only you can park there. Let's say you arrive at work one day, and someone's parked in that spot. No worries, a few phone calls, and the culprit is told to move or towed away. The parking spot qualifies as a right. It was given with authority, and it was enforced. You see, if one of those two requirements is not there, it's not a right. If no one gave you the parking spot, then you have no right to it. And if no one's willing to kick the guy out that parked in it, well then your right is definitely on shaky ground. So if God is not the giver or enforcer of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, who is? Well, the answer is simple. It's the government. This puts rights in a bit of a precarious spot, though, because if the logic is true, then your rights are simply what the government says they are. In this sense, saying someone has a right to life is essentially the same as saying, if you are murdered, we will punish your murderer. I mean, it's better than nothing, and actually it's even better than what we get from the other two so-called inalienable rights. What is a right to liberty? We all know that wherever we live, the government curtails our liberties. Try building an addition onto your house without the proper permits. And I don't even know what the right to pursue happiness is. I don't think it means anything substantial whatsoever. There's nothing intrinsic about a human that demands specific treatment. In fact, history is evidence that human rights are transgressed just about as often as possible. I've heard the argument that the concept of rights, while not ontologically defensible, is still helpful in guiding how we treat one another. And we'll get to that eventually, but let me say here I disagree. Talking about rights in any other way than what those in power are willing to enforce is unhelpful. And our vapid political debates are proof of this. We've covered a few examples of what we might call inalienable natural rights, the ones that may have been ontologically founded on God, but aren't. Let's get into the next set of rights, the ones that are more explicitly granted by government. Let's use two hot-button issues here, one on both sides of the political aisle: the right to bear arms and the right to abortion. I think we can both agree that for both of these issues, there is nothing intrinsic in our humanity, nor granted by God, that ensures that we have a gun or can get an abortion. At least we know that God isn't going to enforce these rights here and now. So we have to assume that these rights are granted by the government. In both cases, there is legislation that grants these rights, and in both cases, there is legislation that restricts these rights. You see, your right to an abortion or to own a gun is exactly what the law says on that issue. When you say abortion is a right or gun ownership is a right, you are saying nothing besides the law allows me to do this. And as soon as the law does not allow you to do it, the right goes away. Now you might say the law should allow me to own guns or to get an abortion, and that's the question that we need to focus on. How do we work through these should questions about law and ethics? Well, it's not by appealing to rights. If you say you have a right to bear arms and the law disagrees, then you're forced to make an argument about the intrinsic merits of gun ownership versus the drawbacks. And that's how political discussion is supposed to happen. When we rely on the concept of rights to back our political and ethical positions, we short-circuit the whole discussion by assuming that our position is backed up ontologically, which it probably isn't. That's not to say there's no right or wrong in ethics and politics. It's also not to say that ontology has no place in our discussion, but that rights are just not the way to go about it. So how should we approach this topic? How can we understand reality in a way that functions to protect what we traditionally know as our rights, while allowing us to have meaningful conversations about policy and ethics? This might be best tackled in another video, mainly because I'm not really sure I have a perfect answer right now. But I think it does involve going back to the foundations that the Enlightenment thinkers abandoned, those being the Bible and Aristotle. Ultimately, instead of looking at what we're entitled to, we ought to consider how we ought to live. What sorts of choices tend to produce the best possible lives for ourselves and for others? By looking at the teleology of man, that is, our end goal, we can begin to build up a system of ethics and politics that most effectively achieves this end. It might not be as cut and dry as the Enlightenment wants you to believe, but at least doing it this way will allow us to have discussions based on true principles and not just argue and yell about what we think our rights are. I hope to pick up this discussion again soon, but I appreciate you watching if you've made it this far. Thank you, and let me know what you think about it down below.